our headlines on this Thursday afternoon, February 22nd, here in South Korea. Close to 14 centimeters of snow fell overnight in Seoul, disrupting morning commute. While in Gangwon-do province, heavy snow alerts remain in place through tomorrow, that is Friday. Meanwhile, the Bank of Korea announces intentions to maintain its benchmark interest rate at 3.5% for the ninth session in a row, while sharing caution about a rate cut in the near future. Also on the local front, doctors in training are staying away from their hospitals for a third day as government authorities appeal to their sense of responsibility on both moral and legal grounds. Capital Seoul woke up to a heavy blanket of snow, and the morning commute, even on train tracks, was reduced to a snail's pace. Our Yoon starts us off.
According to the Korea Meteorological Administration, 13.8 centimeters of snow accumulated in Seoul on Wednesday night. The 8.6 centimeters of snow that fell after midnight was by itself the third highest amount of snow to fall in a single day in February since 2000. Other parts of the metropolitan area also received heavy snowfall, with 9.8 centimeters falling in Incheon and 5.8 centimeters in Suwon. According to officials at Seoul Metro, the overnight snowfall caused delays on Seoul subway lines 2, 5, and 7. Ice formed on railway tracks at a train depot at the eastern end of line number 5 in the Godok-dong neighborhood, which kept trains from leaving the depot on time, leading to delays of about 25 minutes. On lines 2 and 7, signal problems also led to delays of up to 25 minutes. Seoul Metro said it is still working towards fully restoring the tracks and power supply. The precipitation has died down in most places, but Gangwon-do province is expected to see more snowfall on top of the 70 centimeters accumulated since Tuesday. This region is expected to see up to 15 centimeters of snowfall through Friday as heavy snow alerts remain in place. Yoon, Arirang News.
Also here in Seoul, the standoff between doctors in training and relevant government officials remains intense, with patients praying for a quick resolution. Our Yoon has the latest.
The nationwide doctors' strike continued for a third day on Thursday, with doctors protesting against the expansion of South Korea's medical school quota by 2,000 to over 5,000 starting in 2025. Over 9,000 trainee doctors, more than 74% of the country's interns and residents, had submitted letters of resignation as of 10 p.m. Wednesday, though none have been accepted. Out of these, over 8,000 have not shown up for work. The total number of leave of absence letters from medical students announced on Thursday surpassed 11,000 nationwide, which is more than 60% of the total number of medical students. About two-thirds of trainee doctors have walked out of hospitals, meaning medical services have been disrupted and patients are being affected. For example, at Samsung Medical Center, one of Seoul's 5 major teaching hospitals, 30% of operations scheduled for Wednesday were postponed. Surgical procedures at the Severance Hospital were less than half of the usual amount. The focus of large hospitals has shifted to prioritize critical and emergency care, causing outpatient appointments to be postponed, while some patients recovering from surgery were discharged earlier than scheduled. The number of complaints reported increased to almost 150, with 44 of those over surgery cancellations.
My father had emergency surgery for colon cancer, so today I came to check on the results, but I received a text message asking for my understanding, saying that appointments might be delayed due to the high number of patients.
The government has also issued return-to-work orders to the majority of the doctors who have walked out and are asking to discuss the issue with them. In a briefing on Thursday, the government stood firm on its plan to take strong measures, including license suspensions and legal action against those who do not return to work immediately.
The government has decided that at least 2,000 more doctors are needed as soon as possible, taking into account factors like the training period, growing medical demand due to the aging population, and other opinions from different parts of society.
The official added that by the year 2035, around 32,000 doctors aged 70 or older will retire, which based on the current capacity exceeds the number of new graduates over the next 10 years. To this, junior doctors are demanding the government backtracks on the plan to increase the number of medical students, while the Korean Medical Association calls its return-to-work orders amount to suppression. Yoon, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Seoul Central Bank has decided to hold its benchmark interest rate steady at 3.5% for the 9th session in a row. Our correspondent Moon Hae-ryun tells us why.
South Korea's central bank kept its benchmark interest rate steady at 3.5% as widely expected. The decision was announced on Thursday following a monetary policy committee meeting.
Due to supply chain risks posed on global oil prices and continued high consumer costs, slowing inflation will not be easy. We believe that it is necessary to stabilize the inflation rate to the 2% level by maintaining monetary tightening for a sufficient period of time.
This is the 9th consecutive meeting that the BOK has decided to freeze the rate since it was raised to 3.5% in January last year, following 10 consecutive rate hikes in a bid to tackle inflation. Analysts say that there is little reason to rush the lowering of interest rates due to higher-than-targeted price hikes. In January, on-year growth in consumer prices fell to the 2% range for the first time in 6 months. But at 2.8%, it remains above the 2% target. The bank said earlier this month that this figure could tick back up, citing geopolitical uncertainties in the Middle East, which could influence oil prices. Unfavorable weather conditions have also meant that prices for agricultural products such as fresh fruit are continuing to climb. The continued rise in household debt is also a factor cited by experts as being behind the rate freeze. According to recent data, household debt in the final quarter of 2023 increased to its highest level ever, rising by nearly $6 billion on quarter. In January this year, mortgage loans surged by over $3.6 billion compared to the previous month, which is the second largest increase seen since January 2021. It is also unlikely that the BOK will cut interest rates ahead of the United States, with the current key interest rate gap between the two countries at its largest ever at 2 percentage points. Local experts believe that the central bank could ease their monetary policy in the second half of next year, provided the Federal Reserve's pivot policy takes effect in June as currently predicted. Meanwhile, the BOK also maintained its economic growth outlook for this year at 2.1%, as well as the inflation forecast at 2.6% as set last November. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
And in the U.S., financial analytics company S&P Global believes the Federal Reserve will start rate cuts this summer. The firm on Wednesday forecast an initial rate cut of 25 basis points in June, followed by 2 additional cuts to total 75 basis points by the year's end. It added that inflation will slow in the months ahead. As for the U.S.'s real GDP growth this year, the outlook was raised to 2.4% from an earlier projection of 1.5% back in November. Former cryptocurrency entrepreneur Kwon Do-hyung is reportedly likely to face a U.S. court on fraud charges, despite efforts to have him extradited to South Korea. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
22 months since first going on the run and 11 months on from his arrest, a Montenegro court ruled that crypto entrepreneur and Terraform's Lab co-founder Do Kwon should be extradited to the United States. According to a report by the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday, the Pokoricha High Court ruled that Kwon is to be extradited to the U.S., where he has been indicted on charges of crimes committed in the field of financial operations. In 2023, Kwon and Terraform were charged by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission over a multi-billion-dollar fraud. The report added that the court rejected South Korea's request for extradition. Kwon's lawyer argued that his client should be extradited to his home country rather than the U.S. However, the court ruled otherwise. The basis for the decision by the court was not revealed. Kwon was arrested at an airport in Montenegro last March after being caught with fake passports. The charges laid against Kwon and Terraform Labs stem from the collapse of the Terra USD, a stablecoin designed to maintain a constant $1 price, and the Luna token, which was closely linked to Terra USD. Both cryptocurrencies lost an estimated $40 billion or more in May 2022 when Terra USD failed to maintain its $1 peg. The SEC said Kwon and his company deceived investors about the stability of Terra USD and that a popular Korean mobile payment app used the Terraform blockchain to settle transactions. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
President Yoon has pledged to generate $2.5 billion worth of nuclear power projects and to provide extra financing worth $750 million. The pledge was shared earlier on this Thursday during the 14th session of the government's policy briefing open to the public, this time on plans to advance Korea's nuclear power industry. Also, during his term in office, over $3 billion will be earmarked for related R&D, with supporting legal guidelines in place. And President Yoon has raised prospects of removing Greenbelt designation for some regions outside the Greater Seoul area to allow for tangible economic progress. Our top office correspondent Kim Do-yeon covers these prospects.
In Ulsan, the first city that was designated for industrial development, President Yoon shared his plans to utilize more land for new industries to grow. This came on Wednesday as he hosted a livelihood discussion there, a city that led the nation's growth in shipbuilding, automobile, and petrochemical industries.
기존의 패스트 팔로워에서 이제 퍼스트 무버로 탈바꿈을 새롭게 해야 합니다. 정부는 첨단 산업과 미래 산업을 새로운 성장 엔진으로 삼아 울산과 대한민국이 다시 도약할 기회를 만들 것입니다. 이를 위해 제일 중요한 것이 바로 새로운 산업을 전개할 수 있는 입지 공간을 마련하는 것입니다.
He spoke about lifting Greenbelt and agricultural land restrictions to efficiently combine labor, capital, and technology to maximize economic values. Specifically, he said he believes in local government autonomy in terms of lifting restrictions in order to foster competitive industries. To achieve this, he's looking into adjusting the rules when it comes to lifting restrictions, which are the same throughout the country, to be different depending on each region and type of area, as he called such rule a, quote, obstacle. These rules haven't been changed in 20 years. He also added that smart and vertical farming are new industries with a lot of potential, so he will adjust regulations of the agricultural land restrictions for the industry's use of more land. All these reforms and the restrictions of land use, he says, are important to achieving his goal of regional balanced growth.
12개 부처와 지자체의 농지 이용 규제의 종류가 무려 336가지에 달하고 있습니다. 전수조사해서 시대의 변화를 따라가지 못하는 낡은 규제는 신속히 개혁하겠습니다.
At the Wednesday's discussion were 60 citizens, including leaders of big companies in Ulsan and a student from the city's vocational education Meister High School, to share their views on each of the topics. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
In other news, as part of efforts to raise greater awareness of their plight and to embrace their inclusion into a new society, the Yoon administration has decided to designate a day, that is July 14th, for North Korean defectors. Our North Korean affairs correspondent Kim Jung-sil has details.
A much-awaited day for North Korean defectors has been unveiled here in the south. On Wednesday, Seoul's Unification Ministry announced that July 14th will be a day dedicated to honor them.
North Korean Defectors Day will be very symbolic for the 34,000 North Korean defectors who have faced unspeakable adversity in the process of defecting and are now living soundly.
The ministry plans to hold the first ceremony in July as soon as the relevant laws are in place. This is the first time that a celebratory day has been dedicated to defectors from the north, although the South Korean government has offered various support programs since legislation on North Korean defectors was adopted back in 1997. The government support extends from helping them find a home, a job, giving initial settlement money, and offering special college admission, among others. But there have been continuous calls requesting the dedication of a day to honor North Korean defectors, as they sometimes face discrimination in South Korea as someone coming from the north. The South Korean Unification Ministry hopes the day will give more courage and hope to the defectors in their future endeavors here. With Pyongyang's recent comments on South and North Korea being, quote, two separate countries abandoning the idea of reunification, it is the South Korean government's stance to welcome defectors from the North and continue with the aim of reunification that guarantees peace and freedom. Kim Jung-sil, Arirang News.
And for the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the European Union is slapping sanctions on North Korea for its role in advancing the Kremlin's aggression against Kyiv. Our An Sung-jin reports.
The European Union is to impose its first sanctions on North Korea in relation to the Ukraine-Russia war. The Belgian government, which currently holds the rotating EU presidency, announced on X, formerly Twitter, that the 27 EU members approved a 13th package of Ukraine-related sanctions against Russia on Wednesday. It added that it will be one of the most extensive sanctions packages approved by the EU. France 24 stated that the North Korean defense minister and a North Korean firm are reportedly to be added to the sanctions list for supporting the Russian military. Those on the list will be banned from traveling to the EU or doing business there. The EU has previously imposed sanctions on high-ranking North Korean officials for human rights violations and violations of UN Security Council resolutions, but this will be the first time regarding the war in Ukraine. North Korea has reportedly supplied munitions to Russia against Ukraine in return for satellite technology.
At least 24 ballistic missiles of allegedly North Korean origin were used during Russia's missile attacks on the territory of Ukraine.
The new listings will add 193 entities and individuals, mostly for helping Moscow procure weapons or for their involvement in kidnapping Ukrainian children. More details will be released after the package is officially approved on February 24th, which is the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Including the most recent sanctions, the EU sanction list over Russian aggression in Ukraine will have more than 2,000 individuals and entities. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
This week, Ukraine marks a grim milestone of 2 years under Russian aggression. And in light of this reality, my colleague Peunji reached out to the resident head of the UN in Ukraine for her thoughts on the painful plight of people there and for her calls on continued global solidarity. Do take a listen.
This is what an apartment block in Kharkiv looked like after being hit by Russian missile strikes late last month. Since February 2022, thousands have been killed and millions have not been able to return to their homes. As of last month, nearly 3.7 million people remain displaced in Ukraine. And according to the UN Refugee Agency, almost 6.3 million people have crossed into neighboring countries. Denise Brown, the head of the United Nations in Ukraine, currently living in Kyiv, says the air raid sirens still go off a couple of times a day, but people seem to have grown used to them.
I think it's terrible what people can get used to. And Ukrainians, very calm, very, very calm. There's absolutely no panic that I see. My team is not panicked, but it's the stress of what is coming.
She says they've been delivering supplies to regions along the front lines 2 to 3 times a week, as those directly impacted by the war are in need of shelter, health services, bunkers for schools, and psychosocial support. She added nothing has improved, and although everyone is exhausted after 2 years, the Ukrainian people remain strong.
People are tired. It's very true that they are tired, but I don't see any faltering in their determination to stay in their homes and to continue. It's true that the people of Ukraine are very strong. People often say resilient, but it takes a toll. But I think not on the determination.
As the war enters its 3rd year and with the conflict between Israel and Gaza, there are concerns that the focus is slowly shifting away from Ukraine. And she says the most important thing that's needed from the international community is to not forget about the war-torn country.
So it's really important that governments, the member states of the United Nations, speak out about all these contexts and don't forget them, and don't forget Ukraine.
Peunji, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at the latest news in the world now. In the United Kingdom, the country's nuclear deterrent, a Trident missile launched from a submarine, reportedly misfired during a test last month. The Sun newspaper reported on Wednesday that the failed missile crashed into the ocean close to the launch site off the coast of Florida. This is the second time in a row that a test firing of a Trident missile from a Royal Navy submarine has failed. Defense Secretary Grant Shapps, who oversaw HMS Vanguard's launch test, said that on this occasion, an anomaly did occur, but there are no implications for the reliability of the wider Trident missile systems and stockpiles. The previous test in 2016 also failed, with the missile veering off course. British tests of Trident missiles are rare, partially due to the cost, as each missile comes with a price tag of around $20 million. A retired satellite burned up in the Earth's atmosphere over the North Pacific Ocean on Wednesday. According to the European Space Agency, its European remote sensing satellite, the ERS-2, completed its atmospheric re-entry at approximately 6:17 p.m. Central European Time. The ESA also said there were no reports of damage to property due to falling debris. The satellite, which has been out of use since 2011, had been gradually declining in altitude until it reached a critical altitude of around 80 kilometers when strong atmospheric drag began breaking it into pieces. Launched in 1995, the 2-ton satellite collected data on land surfaces, ice, sea levels, and warming oceans, as well as monitoring natural disasters. In the U.S., Alabama Supreme Court ruled on Friday that frozen embryos created during in vitro fertilization can be considered children under state law and are entitled to the same legal rights as any other unborn children. Justice J. Mitchell, who oversaw the majority 7-2 ruling, wrote that unborn children are children without exception based on developmental stage, physical location, or any other ancillary characteristics. This means that frozen embryos are now legally considered extrauterine children. The first of its kind decision comes in response to wrongful death lawsuits in 2021, launched against a fertility clinic in the state after a patient broke into an IVF freezer and dropped a number of trays with frozen embryos. American superstar Beyoncé has become the first black woman to top the Billboard's Hot Country charts. The 42-year-old singer-songwriter reached #1 on the US chart on Tuesday with 2 songs from her upcoming album. The song Texas Hold'em took the top spot, while 16 Carriages came in at #9. Texas Hold'em also reached #2 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. While this is not the first time the Texas native pop star has released country tracks, the songs are the best performing in the genre so far. Kim Seong, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. Hope your morning ride was safe and sound as Seoul received nearly 14 centimeters of snow overnight, causing a messy Thursday morning commute. Precipitation has died down in most places and should let up today, but those in Gangwon-do province need to brace for more snowfall through Friday with up to 30 centimeters in the forecast. The rest of Gangwon-do could see 2 to 15 centimeters with heavy snow alerts remaining in place. Meanwhile, certain parts of the country will receive on and off rain instead of snow through tomorrow under cloudy skies. We had sub-zero temperatures to start the day in the capital, but rising to 4 degrees by the afternoon. Busan will see a high of 7 degrees. And especially those traveling from south to the northern regions today, be prepared for messy roads and stay safe. Meanwhile, Jeju Island will see on and off rain through Sunday. Then Jeollanam-do is forecast to see a winter mix this weekend with more up and down temperatures in most parts of Korea. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And those are the headlines at this hour here in Korea. Coming up right after this break is our daily panel session. So do stay with us and thank you for now.
Lotte takes a new leap beyond its boundaries. Our change will lead to better lives for all. New Lotte, the power of a better world. New today, better tomorrow. Lotte.
한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
하나, 둘, 셋.
Hey, Mr. Cupid, who's lying next sure you listen to what I say. I may be stupid or quite naive.
끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟. 휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니?
Arrow straight through my heart.
In this edition of Issues and Insiders, we delve into efforts to ensure the return of cultural artifacts taken from Korea in the past. So what are some of the treasures that remain far from home? What have been the gains of efforts to ensure their return? And what are the current laws against looting? Hello, you're watching Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today we address efforts to ensure the return of cultural artifacts that were stolen or smuggled, especially during times of past conflict. For more on this, I have Nam Ji-eun from the Cultural Heritage Restoration Foundation here in the studio. Gina, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
I also have our trainee An Jun-sung with us. Mr. An, it's a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Right, Gina, let's start off then with an understanding about the size of Korea's cultural artifacts that remain overseas and yet to return home.
Right, so we have, according to the Overseas Korean Cultural Heritage Foundation, we have about 240,000 artifacts overseas. And the first country, well, the number one country with the most Korean artifacts is Japan, with over 45%. And then we have the US and Germany. But all of these numbers, they don't represent items that have yet to be returned because some of them have been gifted or they've been legally acquired. So they're not all appropriate for restitution. But a lot of them, of course, have a lot of research that needs to be done regarding their provenance. So the majority of them might still have to be considered for repatriation. But yeah, so far we have over 240,000 items.
And most of the items that we're seeking to have returned to the country are those perhaps that have been looted or the ones that have also been legally acquired?
So for restitution, the basis has to be either illegal trafficking or smuggling or looting, and that can be during wartime or it can be done by individuals. So in Korea's case, the reason that Japan has so many is because there have been a lot of conflicts between Korea and Japan, in which case a lot of Korean artifacts have made their way to Japan. And the number actually continues to increase every year because the more we do investigative research, the more we find out. And a lot of institutions have artifacts around the world as well too, but a lot of private individuals, as they pass away, their collections are starting to come to the surface. So the number of artifacts that are overseas continues to rise.
Right, I see. And Ms. Chan, before we advance any further, do give us some legal perspective on the matter. What can you tell us about the laws against looting?
Yes, well, there's an international law on point, actually. It's called the 1970 UNESCO Convention on Cultural Property. And, you know, I think it's significant because that it is the first multilateral international agreement to fight against looting. Means that multilateral means that more than two, basically, you know, over 100 countries have signed it. So it's very important, significant international development. However, there are some other limitations and some, you know, some challenges. But it was adopted in 1970, and which was came in force in 1972. Why do I mention about 1972? That the application only, the convention only apply anything happened, trafficking happened after 1972. So there's there's some debate on issues that it's really effective because a lot of things happened actually before 1970, the effective year of the convention.
Right, I see. Gina, I understand you were part of a campaign that saw the restitution of philosopher and politician, of course, Song Xiao's work, 송자대전. Could you walk us slowly through that particular endeavor?
Yes. So last year, I was able to recover over 12 wooden printing blocks, and they were in Japan and Korea. And one of them happened to be teacher Song Xiao's wooden printing block. And that's what the 송자대전 book is. And so we found a wooden printing block copy. So there's over 11,000 teacher Song Xiao's wooden printing blocks from what we understand. And so I was able to recover one of them from the States. And right now we're doing a lot more research according to, to understand the contents of it because it's in Chinese characters. And accordingly, we might use it to conduct more education to the youth, or we might repatriate it to the appropriate location.
So getting this artwork back within a year then, was it? Or did it take longer, the negotiations? I wonder how long the discussions took.
The negotiations didn't take as long because we had to conduct it online, and the conclusion was reached quite quickly. And so we were able to negotiate that aspect really fast. However, bringing it back to Korea took a while because we had to go and get it, but we were overseas a lot too. And so we had to find a way to get to the America and then bring it back.
So relatively, that was a fast procedure then?
Yes.
Relatively speaking.
1 year is quite fast.
Right, and that being said, I asked because, Ms. Tan, there were similar restitution efforts by Korea's Cultural Heritage Administration that took 15 years of negotiations with Boston's Museum of Fine Arts. Could you tell us a bit about that endeavor, the details, the results, as well as I understand there's some remaining issues of conflict there?
Yeah, that's a very interesting negotiation case, actually. It took 15 years. Actually, in terms of the cultural property negotiation, it takes more than a decade, very common, so also many times. But it's very successful. I think, in a way, from my perspective, I think very successful negotiation. A lot of details with two parts. First part is that the sarayna, so in Korean is sari, the remain of the the Korean Buddhist bank, not only there's some Indian Buddhist monks, right? And the other part is the saraya container, we call sariham in Korean. So basically what happened was that there was a 15 years negotiation. Boston Museum have decided to donate the saraya, the sari, to the Korean temple. And prior to the Buddha's birthday this year, which is for on the May 15th. And however, they decided not to donate the the sariham, the container, the saraya container, to the Korean temple. And there are some issues that I think the one of argument they made by the Boston Museum is that when they took the position of that the cultural property it was the legal way. It's not illegal. That's one of the argument. But if we actually see the 1970 UNESCO Convention, actually, the title of the UNESCO Convention actually used the term illicit, not illegal. There's difference from legal perspective. When you say illegal means prohibited by law. Illicit, well, it's not really legal. You don't use it often in the legal term, but illicit means that something socially prohibited, something go against the social norms or the values, right? Something is much broader than actually legal, the frameworks. So in a way, I think that Boston, Museum didn't really consider about what's the point of UNESCO Convention, because the UNESCO Convention actually talk about illicit transfer of the stolen. And then they know that actually the Boston Museum knew that it's come from the Korean temple. That's what they're saying. Actually, so I guess that's the one and good. Also, I think that also that saraya used to have the religious value. I mean, spiritual value. It's something. It's not about. It's different from something. You talk about 고려청자 or something. It's something spiritual meaning value to it. So I think they should have returned earlier. And the other thing is that, and that there's further negotiation. The issue about the loan agreement, because that in a way happened was that they decided not to give the ownership of the sari container, and they say we provide on the loan basis. And according to the press, they have not decided specific terms of their arrangement, but still they're going to do it. But there was some debate on is it correct? I mean, is it best way to return it on the loan basis? From my perspective, I think it's better than nothing actually. But something illegally took out of country, coming back centuries later, 2 centuries later, it doesn't really matter how form, and as long as we get a physical ownership on it, we can get it. I think that's the good enough.
Right, especially because this particular relic, I understand, dates back to the 14th century.
Yeah.
Right, Mr. Yoon, do you suppose then art restitution in the form of loans, as you mentioned earlier, is perhaps the first step in the right direction to ultimately ensure their complete return to the country?
That's a very interesting question, because I have myself the same question, because I used to teach the Joseon dynasty's manuscript, the return negotiation, which took 18 years, and they were struggling. And I actually talked to the NGO, the Cultural Action. I called them actually. I was wondering about what's going on, and there was a public debate on should we get it at a loan basis or should we fight for the complete return, complete ownership return. And I asked them, the director of the NGO, say, is it better we getting back physically, at least better than nothing. And fighting another decade, I think what's the point, right? And he said, like, well, I think you're right, And then later I found out that a few weeks later they decided to go for the, the loan basis, because you have to look at the reality of the international politics, that can you really take it, we lost it because of some reason, because the war, any reason is gone, right? We take it back, it's not easy. If we want to get legal ownership of it, that's a very different issue. About the manuscript case, the Joseon Dynasty, the problem was that the French government registered the part of National Archive. They categorized as the national treasure, or French national treasure. So what happened was that even if the Sarkozy, then President Sarkozy, tried to return their ownership to the Korean government, they have the problem with the legal issue, because that it's illegal to take it out or transfer ownership to another country. So they end up with loan agreement. So keeping legal ownership in a French National Library and giving back to the physical ownership on 5-year loan basis with automatic renewal. But actually, if you're looking at the agreement, they say French government can object to renewal technically, but then do not take that action. That's the issue. How in practicality issue, right?
Right, I see. Moving forward, Gina, do you suppose the recent global popularity of K-entertainment, including, of course, K-music, K-movies, as well as its dramas, has it perhaps renewed greater interest in K-cultural artifacts?
I definitely think so. I think that thanks to the K-wave, a lot of people around the world are showing interest in Korea. I think the Korean government has done a lot of effort, and the Korean people, and we can't ignore what the Korean diaspora population has done for many, many years. They were civilian ambassadors for Korea, so all of these efforts have accumulated to this greater awareness and interest in Korea, and I think that naturally goes further. I think they want to know more about modern Korea, and they want to understand how Korea came to be, why Korea is the way it is, and more about history. And what they want to know is the difference between Korea and China and Japan, because what happens in a lot of the museums abroad that I've seen personally is a lot of Korean artifacts have been mislabeled as Japanese or Chinese. So even the wooden printing blocks that I found was listed as Chinese wooden printing blocks, but I asked some of our scholars and they recognized that these were by Korean scholars. And so in such cases, there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lack of clarity, and we still have a lot of curators that need to be developed and sent overseas and taught about Korean history and how to properly display them or preserve them. And so there is a lot of interest, but there's still so much that needs to be done. And in terms of repatriation, since 1945, our liberation, we've had 11,000 returned, and there's still so much more that needs to be done. And so I think with all the interest that's been garnering, Korea is definitely has a lot of work to do. She has a lot of work to do in terms of packaging and helping other people understand what Korean history is, why our culture is so celebrated in Korea. And I think Korea can continue to take steps forward, not only by talking about the artifacts that she wants to find again, that Korea wants to find again, but to help other countries to locate theirs, because artifact repatriation is an issue that a lot of other countries in the world are dealing with.
Right, and I understand also that there is a growing number of activists who are actually leading the global push to recover these looted artifacts. How do you explain this relatively recent phenomenon?
Yeah, I think cultural artifact repatriation, it's getting a lot of attention nowadays all around the world, because in the past, looting was the norm. Spoils, taking spoils after war, and the stronger cultural power or the country would take over other countries. But I think nowadays, a lot of people are realizing that their identity comes from their history and their cultural heritage. And the reason that we call it cultural heritage, even the Korean law is being passed where we don't say cultural property, but we say cultural heritage now, because we understand the necessity of passing this on to future generations and also celebrating it together. And I think people understand that that's where their identity comes from. They want to have their voice heard on the international stage. They want to make sure that their narrative and their perspective is shown as well, history in its original and appropriate context. And that's why we have restoration movements. And I think it's a great thing to see ordinary civilians really rise up and go online and make polls or discussions and demand repatriation and have these efforts as well. And in our foundation's case, we also represent 1,600 ordinary Korean civilians. So we have the government's role and I think the civilians' role. And whenever we go overseas and we tell them we represent 1,600 people who have signed up with us, they're really moved because they understand that it seems like cultural heritage is something that the government should take care of. And although the government does represent the people, we have ordinary citizens who don't want their cultural heritage to be swayed by politics sometimes. And like we said, negotiations take a long time, and it's even more so when we have bureaucracy involved and politics involved. But sometimes we have the overseas Korean diaspora who are able to locate these artifacts, purchase it with their own money, and donate it back to Korea. And so I think a lot of these ordinary or average movements is a beautiful thing to see, and I think we're going to continue to see how much it impacts the restitution movement.
Right, and keeping in mind what Gina has just said, Ms. Tan, speaking within your capacity as, of course, a former college professor, what efforts can be made on the diplomatic front to perhaps better support efforts by the civilians to have our cultural heritage returned?
Well, actually, if you see the 1970 UNESCO Convention, actually, the way you process it, you have to use the diplomatic channel, actually, when you're using it. The problem was that there's so much limitation on using the UNESCO Convention. That's the problem. So going back to the French negotiation, that when it was the cultural action, the NGO actually brought action, legal action in Paris court, actually. They sued the National Library of France, actually, to get returned the ownership of the national treasure, basically. So very interesting because they was very active. I think that there's coordination, need to get coordination between public and private sector. Not only that, it takes really long time, at least a decade if you're big ones. So litigation, sometimes litigation. So you have to be very persistent. And then also, I think that doing the research, you find that one of the things you have to do it on the more return of the future is that you need to get more research on what we have, why we don't have it. And for use the UNESCO Convention, you need to have to show documentation requirements so that certain cultural property is documented to the inventory of some certain institution, basically. So you have to get more research in Korea, actually, to find out why we have it, what kind of things we can prove it, right? And also that, in a way, you can do it in the overseas. If going back to that, French case, right? Actually, the French librarian, Dr. Lee Byung-sun, actually, she found it by herself. Actually, before she found that the manuscript, it categorized as a Chinese book, because it was written in Chinese. So nobody knew, in France, nobody knew it was a Korean manuscript. So she found it because she was Korean, right? So, and it took her like almost 20 years to get it back. Yeah, so I guess the more research side is very significant. Also that public awareness, in terms of the Japan situation, since that there's more than 40% of the cultural property is, in Japan. If you look at the UNESCO Convention, actually, the Japan signed the convention 2002. So it means that both countries, when the convention become effective after both countries become the signatory to the convention. So anything before 2002, actually, UNESCO Convention was now apply. That's the limitation. So there's a lot of things, international application issues, and public awareness also. Yeah, I think that's the issues that you have to do, and the further research on the, historic research on the documentation.
Right, knowing what is out there, as Gina had mentioned earlier. Gina, is there a Korean cultural artifact that you would personally like to see returned in the near future?
I think there's so many, and I think the list would go on, especially the more we find out. But currently, I have two in mind, actually. The first one is called Baekje's Smile. So it's actually a Buddhist statue that was found in Puyo, where the Baekje Kingdom used to be, and it was taken to Japan. And right now, a private individual currently owns it. And so we know some people and our, members of our foundation have been a part of that negotiation process for over 10 years now. And so in the case before, taking 1 year is a really fast process, and even 10, it takes a long time to have these things recovered. So that's the first case. The smile of the Buddhist statue is so beautiful, that's why we call it Baekje's Smile, right? The second one is also in Japan, actually. It's the Ogura collection. And that Ogura collection was taken, I forgot the exact date, actually, but there's so many dates that we have to remember. But when the Ogura collection was taken, when Korea and Japan signed an agreement in 1965, they said that the national inventory in Japan, so those would be under research and those would be liable for restitution perhaps. But private individuals, the Japanese government couldn't touch. But the Ogura collection went over to the Tokyo National Museum. And so when it went over into the national holding, Korea was supposed to be alerted, and they were supposed to be told, listen, we have this private individual's collection that's coming into our collection now. Would you like to conduct research and perhaps talk about repatriation efforts? But from our research so far, from all diplomatic channels and any paperwork, Korea was not notified. And so that is something that we have to look at legally as well, whether they did breach that agreement and if it is a demand for restitution.
Right, and keeping in mind what Gina has just said, then Mr. An, is there a way to facilitate collaboration between private and public parties, legally that is, in efforts to recover looted artwork?
It's a very interesting question, actually. The UNESCO Convention is very limited application. So actually, it's supposed to do transaction between the art dealer and museums, most likely, but do not regulate the museum, only the art dealers, something they're selling illegally or something, stolen property. And so basically the museum is, they have like free will, whatever they want to do it. That's what happened to Boston Museum. They say, oh, you don't want to give it, so they can keep it for a long time, right? So for Japan's case, like many individuals have it, but that's quite different story, because that if it's a national collection, just like Joseon Dynasty, the manuscript, there's other legal implications, right? How government, basically G2G, right? Government bilateral relations. But if it's a private sector, private individual, that's a really different issue that I think that should be, if they push it too much, they don't like it much, because the individuals, right? Maybe the NGOs or the, some other organizations have to do it, not the government, because government may be too much, to them, too much pressure, because they know they took it illegally, even though they have legal ownership at this time, but this moment, but they know it was illegally stolen from that, Korea, and they, they don't want to talk to it. I remember that during the Obama administration, they returned the national seal of the Joseon Dynasty, 5 seals. I remember the one thing that happened was that it's not them. I think U.S. Marine took it from ditch of the Doksu Palace.
Right.
And he claimed that, oh, I took it from, that was in the ditch. Right. And then it was very interesting, though, how it happened was the U.S. government found out, right? And that there was illegally took it. And then there was the actual lieutenant was passed away. Their family member found that there's something here very valuable, very valuable, but they're not sure what it is. And they had some issue. I think they have tax issue, some legal issue of government. So government had to deal with their family that if you give back to the national treasure, to us, we'll deal with your legal issues. So some issues happen. So you have to be
It's a very daunting task to get
so it's a lot of coordinations, and then the other government side, like U.S. government, something like that. But they did it. They have to really willing to do, cooperate. That's very important.
Which is why I said it's a very difficult task, and we are so happy that people like Gina are trying to work very hard to get our artwork back then. All right, Gina, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Mr. An, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow.